Hello and welcome back to Senior Gardens. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about field growing again, and here I have 3 trees that I selected. I didn't really select them on a variety for field growing. I selected them more on size and where you want to start for field growing if you want a massive tree. Here I have an oak. I believe this is a water oak. This is a American elm. I think it's the American winged elm. And here I think it is a Japanese privet. I've never really figured out exactly what kind of plant this is, but I think it's a Japanese privet or maybe Chinese privet. But these trees are about the size that you want to start with growing in the ground. You can start with later trees. If you see my previous episode, previous episode, you can pretty much have something up to that size that you can put in the ground. With something like that, that's probably going to be the end result after about 5 years though. So about 5 years younger than those trees. You can have about an inch trunk, about something like that. And you can start with something like that, that's maybe in a 3-gallon size pot, and put it in the ground. That's really where you want to start, is with a mature tree. This tree is, I think this is its 3rd year of growth. I think this one is in its 4th year, if I'm remembering correct. I have no idea how old this one is. Most of my native elms are just seeds that have popped up over time in pots, and I just grew them on into bonsai, and I never really kept track of their age, but I have tons of them because they just grow like crazy. But you start with something like this, and maybe something like this that's potted into a 3-gallon pot, and then put that in the ground, which will have about a 1-inch trunk, maybe 1.5 inch or so. But what you do is you just take it out of its pot and you put it in the ground. You let it grow, and there are different methods for letting it grow. One method is to, as it's growing, cut back, like you can cut a round circle around the pot, or around the root system of the tree, basically at the edge of the branching. Like on this tree right here, if this was in the ground, I would cut it about right here and about right here. And when you do that, you're cutting it about once every year, usually in the spring. You can also do it in the fall, but you can also do it like, you can do the one half here and there in the spring, and this back in the back half back here in the fall, or you can do 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, and do that over the course of an entire year. There's also the method of that you're going to be cutting the roots regularly, but your timing can either be in a situation of every year, which is most common because it produces the best root base. There's the method of every other year, which allows stronger growth over 2 years, and then you cut it back. This does not usually get as good of a root base as every year, but it promotes faster growth and then less time in production, but you're not going to have as good of a chance for an awesome root system. There are variations of this, such as cutting it, like the cutting in front and in the back, or 1/4 and it forced all through the year, and rotating. And it really comes down to, when it comes to field growing in the ground, it really comes down to the root pruning technique of how you're trying to do the growth. There are different ways of doing this. The every year method, the every other year. There's also the method of just letting the tree grow like crazy for about 5, maybe 6 growing seasons, and then digging it up and pruning back the roots really hard, putting it in a pot or putting it back in the ground if you still want it to grow, and then kind of developing it from there and repeating that process. And that's actually what Peter Chan talks about in one of his books, is the field growing method of doing this root pruning once every 5 years. I'm also going to cover some experimentation that I plan on doing in the future as far as this technique goes, which is the timing. With the timing, some of the experiments that I plan on doing is cutting, like as it's growing the first year or two, cutting every year, and then digging and then cutting it after every year for the first 2 years. And then as the growth really starts to take off after that, I can actually let it grow out a little bit more and cut 2 years later, so it's on the fourth year of the fourth growing season having ended, and then I'm cutting it again and then letting it grow for maybe 3 years and then pruning it, so it will be on the 7th year of growth, and then keep increasing that as it prunes until I've gotten to a certain point that I feel comfortable digging it up, doing a major overhaul of the root system so that it can ensure a really solid root base and not let the root base get out of hand. As like in my previous episode, the maples had a very bad root base, generally speaking, because you actually want to make sure the roots are pruned and are kept in check so that they develop that really nice root base. So that's why you want to prune the roots, is to develop that root base. Because without root pruning, while if you let them grow long enough into like a actual real tree, they usually develop really amazing root bases. But if you're trying to keep them small and in a bonsai size, generally speaking, you want to prune the roots because you want to make sure that they have that root base that looks good in a small pot, which you're generally not going to be able to see the roots really spread and grow crazy like a mature oak or something. So you really want to keep the roots in check, make sure they grow the way you want them to, and ensure a really high quality root system. That's what root pruning does. And with a field growing, it all comes down to timing on when you prune, how you prune, and a methodology of pruning the roots that determines exactly how you want to grow it. If you want fast, massive growth as fast as possible and producing the largest tree in a shortest amount of time, but maybe not the best tree that you could possibly have, you generally want to spend the maximum amount of time that you can without pruning the roots. And when you do that, the maximum amount of time is 5 to 6 growing seasons before you dig it up and do a massive overhaul to the roots, whether that be putting it into a pot and then growing it on, or just digging it up, pruning the roots, dealing with the roots, making sure they're doing what they're supposed to, then put it back in the ground and grow it again for another 5 years. But generally speaking, 5 to 6 growing seasons is the max you can keep a tree in the ground before you absolutely have to dig it up and deal with the root system in order to ensure that you don't get an absolutely terrible root system. And however, if you want to if you're not really concerned about having the biggest tree possible or in the quickest time possible, the method of every year or every other year of root pruning generally allows you to get a lot of really strong growth, but it also ensures the root system will really be really good, but you're not going to get it's going to take longer than if you just let the tree grow like crazy for several years. It generally restricts the growth. You also often see when you prune the roots every year or every other year, you'll have a few leaves, especially at the beginning of the growing season, that are obviously messed up from the damaged root system and issues to deal with that. However, you still get the field growing strength, but not as much as you would have over the root system growing and the exponential growth after that. Because the more time it spends in the ground, the more roots it can grow. And the more roots it can grow, the more root it can grow up, the more stems it can grow upwards. And when that happens, that's just going to keep growing each and every year that you don't prune the roots. But that also means that you're not going to have the refined root system that you want. So you want to keep it restrained to some extent. Now, it really depends on whether you want a fast, massive tree, or if you just want to speed up the process of a medium-sized, maybe slightly large tree, and not necessarily risk losing the refined root system. Because if you're growing strictly in pots without field growing, you can generally obtain a really nice root base, especially with the right type of pots, such as a shallow pot, one with holes in the sides, which allows the air root pruning and other methods for developing that beautiful bonsai root system that we all know. And that, when you're doing that, you generally will have a small tree, probably not much bigger than this, maybe about an inch and a half in size, but it's always been in a pot. But it'll have a beautiful root base most of the time. The field growing method sacrifices that root base to varying degrees to encourage this growth to take off, the stem to thicken much faster, and generally is a grower's technique to develop the large trees that we want in the shorter time. Because if you're taking a tree like this and taking it to a massive trunk in pots only, that's going to take an extremely long time, and generally will probably not end up finished unless you're very young when you start it. You're probably never going to see the finished result of it if it's simply growing in a pot for a large trunk. That's why we use the field growing techniques, is to encourage the faster growth, give them the room to grow and allow them to really take off, so that they can develop that large trunk that we want, so we can have a massive tree that has that massive trunk. And it really is an impressive sight to see when you see an amazing massive trunk, amazing small tree like this, that it's beautiful. It really is when you see these massive trees. The small trees are also very beautiful too, but they generally don't take as long to produce a smaller tree compared to a larger tree, and that's why they are grown in pots, is because they're meant to have that high level of refinement, the maximum amount of control over roots, maximum control over the stems, to develop a really beautiful refinement in a nice small tree. The field growing technique is meant to develop that massive trunk that we can actually enjoy the finished result of, that we can have a 25-year-old tree that we can actually see in our lifetimes as a beautiful tree, and maybe finish it in our lifetime, even if we're fairly young compared to being in a pot. And that's why we want to use the field growing technique, is so that we can really get that growth. So in short, we usually use the pot method, the pots, to develop smaller trees and keep them controlled and make a more refined root system, a more refined branching, and keep it under control. When we're using the field growing technique, is to give them the growth, so that instead of spending 50 years to develop a 6-inch trunk, we can spend maybe 5, 10, 15 years developing that same trunk. But we do sacrifice some things, such as the quality of the root system compared to in a pot. We sacrifice the branch refinement. We take the risk of occasionally having large gaping cuts that we may have to put on the back of the tree from a massive trunk. And these are sacrifices that must be made in order to see the results of our massive 6, 8, 10-inch trunk within our lifetime on a massive, beautiful tree. So I hope you enjoy this episode. Anyways, if you like my content, give a thumbs up. If you like my other content, subscribe below. Hit that bell icon if you want to see more notifications. See you on the next episode from Scenic Gardens. So long.